Hi, I'm Russell Kirkby. This is Sidario. Now, there's no right or wrong way to interpret the rules as written in Dungeons & Dragons. Today, I want to give you a few tips about how you can manage and roleplay critical hits, critical skill checks, and critical failures in your game. So what happens when you roll your d20 for your attack roll and you roll a 20 or a 1? Well, a 20 is a critical hit, and it doesn't matter what the modifiers are, it doesn't matter what the armor class is, you always hit on a 20. Similarly, when you roll a 1, this is a critical failure, and it doesn't matter about the armor class, it doesn't matter what modifiers you might have on top of your roll. A 1 is a failure, it misses. Okay, so when you get a critical hit with an attack roll, you get to double the dice of the weapon attack. So if it's a dagger, for example, it's a d4 typically, you get to double that. You roll 2d4. Now if you've got a sneak attack, because you're a rogue, you've got the sneak attack feature, that's typically a d6. So now you're adding your d4, doubling your d4, you're rolling 2d4, and you get to roll a d6 for your sneak attack, you get to roll 2d6 for your sneak attack. So you've got 2d4 and 2d6, and you roll all of those dice and you add those together, and now you add the modifier at the end. So what happens when you roll a critical success or a critical failure and you're making a skill check? This is a bit different from attack rolls. In the rules as written, there is in fact no such thing as a critical success or a critical failure. So you get to add your modifiers, and that's the number that you get against the difficulty class of the task that you've been given by the DM. So you might be a rogue, you've got expertise, you get a plus 12 plus 16 to your dice roll, so even if you roll a 1, you could potentially still succeed. Now, a lot of DMs will still say that a 1 or a 20 is a critical success. These are homebrew rules, these are house rules, but they may very likely apply because a lot of DMs use them, and if you roll a 1 with a skill check, you may very well fail. And if you roll a 20, you may very well succeed, regardless of the actual difficulty class of the skill check. So it might be that you roll a 20 on your lockpicking and the DC is very high and you automatically succeed. Or it could be a case of you roll a 1 with your lockpicks and you break your lockpicks. If the DM decides that the task that you're trying to achieve is impossible, then your critical 20 may not actually succeed the way you want it to. If you try to jump off a building in Neverwinter and you want to arrive in Waterdeep, now that's a task that's pretty much impossible. You can roll your d20 and you can hope just to land on your feet. If you're really lucky and the DM's nice, you might land on the back of a cart that's on its way to Waterdeep, but you're not going to jump off a building and land in Waterdeep. Critical successes and failures with saving throws are very much the same as skill checks. The rules as written don't actually cover this at all. There are no critical successes or critical failures with saving throws. However, again, it's up to the Dungeon Master. A lot of Dungeon Masters like to utilize this system in order to add a little bit of flavor to the game. So, for example, a monster with a very high challenge rating might have a very high DC, like for example 24, and even with your modifiers, you might only be able to roll a 21. So theoretically, you wouldn't be able to match that DC, but the DM might feel lenient and allow you to roll a natural 20 and succeed despite the fact that you don't reach that DC technically. They may allow you to get out of the way and take half damage instead of full damage on that fireball. Critical successes to hit rolls can potentially be heroic moments for your player characters. This is your opportunity to give the player a chance to shine through their role-playing and through the storytelling that you're doing. This might be a moment where the player is going to go home and tell their family and their friends and their workmates all about this moment that occurred in the game where failure was turned around, where something that seemed impossible was achieved. So you want to give an opportunity to your players to actually have these heroic moments from time to time, and when they roll 20s, this is a great opportunity for you to do that. Critical hits and critical failures can get quite repetitive in game. There's a fairly high chance of rolling a 1 or a 20 on any given dice roll. So using the context of the scene is a really good way to inform the outcomes of your critical successes and failures in order to change the gears up and make them more flavorful. So let's take an example where we have two characters who are rolling around grappling one another, and you've got a third character who's going to come along and try and attack the enemy. They're trying to save their friend who's grappling with the enemy on the ground, and they're rolling over in the grass, tumbling around, right? So now you're going to roll your dice to hit, and you're trying to hit the enemy, obviously, not your friend, and it's going to be tricky because they're rolling and they're moving. This is part of the dynamics of the scene, and this is the context. So now, using that context, we can decide that if you get a 20, you hit critically the enemy character, but if you roll a 1, you may very well hit your friend. And that is how you use context to inform your critical success outcome or your critical failure. So when it comes to critical fails, you really want to read the room to make sure that your players aren't getting demoralized if they've had a few critical fails and they're not really having fun anymore. So when you're considering this, you might want to be a little bit less punitive in terms of your descriptions and outcomes for your critical fails. As a dungeon master, when you are making skill checks with your players and your players make critical failures for their attack rolls specifically, you really have to think about how punishing you're going to be, and you need to think about that from the beginning of the campaign too, because you're going to set the mood and the tone for the whole story for the rest of the game. So if you're playing a game where you want it to be gritty and realistic, and you want them to make critical failures and reasonably often, you want to consider that, and you want to set that tone early on so the players can adjust to that. Whereas if you're going to have a more forgiving kind of a game where critical failures aren't going to necessarily mean the end of the world every time they make one, you probably want to set the tone for that too near the beginning of the game, so that for the rest of the campaign your players are not spending their entire time freaking out about it. Some dungeon masters will simply say you drop your weapon, you break your weapon, you hit your friend, you hit yourself, you lose your arrow, you break your arrow. You could make a table out of these things to sort of make it even more, to give some variety and flavor to that. And also, tables are quite useful because you can mitigate the fact that there's actually a 5% chance of getting a critical failure every time you roll to hit. And that's not necessarily very realistic. I mean, more usually I would think that when you try to hit something and you're either going to hit or you're going to miss most of the time. It's very unlikely that you would actually have a critical failure and break your weapon or otherwise cause yourself some sort of further trouble. How do you handle a natural 1 when you're a player? So really, the best way to handle rolling a critical failure as a player character, don't throw your toys. What you want to do is read the room, read the DM, look at the context of the scene, and figure out why you rolled that natural 1. What was the factor involved in the scene? What is the context of the scene, and how can I read the context of the scene and the dynamics of the scene to inform my failed action and make it fun? Make it fun for myself. Make it fun for the group. This is an opportunity for you to reveal plot, theme, or character. So don't throw your toys.